The High Frost Court smelled of burnt cedar and old judgment. It was a cavernous, brutalist architectural marvel carved directly into the heart of the northern mountains, designed specifically to dwarf the individuals standing within its iron-wrought pillars. The ambient temperature was kept deliberately low, a perpetual chill that forced the blood to retreat to the center of the body, reminding every wolf present that they survived only by the grace of the pack. Tonight, however, the cold was not merely atmospheric, it was intensely, suffocatingly personal. Lyra Sterling stood in the exact center of the obsidian dais, her raw, labor-scarred hands resting loosely against the coarse wool of her grey skirts. She did not look at the roaring hearth fires that lined the perimeter of the hall. She refused to glance at the 2,000 members of the assembly, who had gathered in absolute, suffocating silence to watch her ruin. Her gaze was fixed entirely on the object in the hands of the man she loved. The rejection ceremony was supposed to break her. Everyone in the sprawling, shadowy expanse of the grand hall expected her to shatter. They anticipated the sudden, violent collapse of her knees against the unforgiving stone. They waited for the weeping, the desperate clawing at his boots, the pitiful, high-pitched begging of an Omega who possessed no noble lineage, no political leverage, and no innate magic to justify her place beside the crown. Instead, it became the moment her entire world froze into a crystalline, immovable stoicism. Lyra kept her spine perfectly straight. Her breathing was measured, shallow, and impeccably controlled, rising and falling in a rhythmic cadence that betrayed absolutely nothing of the slaughter occurring beneath her ribs. Before her stood Vance Ashwood. He was a terrifying physical specimen, possessing a sharp, ruthless grace, radiating the lethal authority of an alpha king who had spent his entire life preparing to die for his people. He wore the crown of winter iron, its jagged points casting long, spidery patterns of darkness across his sharp cheekbones, his storm-grey eyes, which had once softened into molten gold when they were alone in the quiet hours of the night, were now locked in a flat, impenetrable stare. His jaw was clenched so tightly that a muscle ticked furiously beneath his skin, and the knuckles of his massive hands were completely bloodless where he gripped the ceremonial vessel. It was the silver-rimmed dissolution cup, a sacred, ancient artifact forged from melted-down war blades, filled with a highly concentrated, salt-based liquid that burned like acid against the tongue. It was the physical instrument of a spiritual execution. To drink from it, and to speak the words of severance in front of the assembled court, was to voluntarily take a blade to the sacred thread woven between their souls, stretching, tearing, bleeding it until it finally snapped. The High Frost Court cannot survive on affection alone. Vance's voice resonated through the cavernous space, a deep, rumbling baritone that carried the sheer weight of a sovereign's decree. There was a subtle roughness in his tone, a faint, almost imperceptible vibration that spoke of immense physiological self-restraint. He was holding his breath, Lyra realized with a strange, detached clarity. He was actively refusing to inhale, terrified that if her natural scent of rain and crushed pine reached his lungs, his inner beast would override his political will and tear the room apart. Our borders are failing. The western geothermal vents are freezing over. The treaty with the Southern Territories requires a union of blood and status, a union that can secure the survival of this valley. Heed did not look at her when he said it. His tempestuous gaze remained fixed on the space just above her shoulder. Standing 3 paces behind him, half-cloaked in the shadows of the royal alcove, was Mariska Vane. The southern heiress was entirely flawless, draped in pristine silver silks that shimmered like freshly fallen snow, smelling overwhelmingly of poisoned honey and expensive southern orchids. Mariska wore a polite, frozen smile, her chin tilted upward in a silent declaration of absolute victory. She was the political leverage Lyra lacked. She was the wealth, the army, and the strategic alliance the council had demanded Vance secure. Therefore, by the ancient laws of the hinterlands, I must sever what was made, Vance continued, his voice dropping a fraction of an octave, taking on a somber, gravelly texture that vibrated against the iron pillars. He extended his massive arm, offering the ceremonial chalice toward Lyra. The liquid inside rippled, reflecting the orange light of the hearth fires. Lyra Sterling, I, Vance Ashwood, Alpha King of the High Frost Court, reject this bond. I release you from my side, from my protection, and from my bloodline. You will be provided a pension of gold to ensure your comfort, on the condition that you leave the inner valley before the turning of the moon. Deep within the subconscious cage of Lyra's mind, her inner wolf let out a guttural, agonizing shriek. The phantom creature clawed frantically at the confines of her ribs, whining in a pitch of pure, instinctual terror as the biological tether tying them to their fated mate was unceremoniously dipped in acid. Lyra felt the immediate, physical manifestation of the severing. A searing, white-hot agony blossomed across the left side of her collarbone, where his claiming mark had begun to form during their quiet, secret nights. It felt as though a branding iron had been pressed directly to her bare skin, sinking through the muscle, sand searing the bone itself. The pain was so absolute, so blinding, that her vision swam with black spots. She did not flinch. She did not raise a hand to her collarbone to soothe the burning flesh. She simply stood there, absorbing the monumental violence of his words with the stillness of a frozen lake. She watched the slow, agonizing descent of his dark irises as they finally met hers. He was waiting for the tears. The entire court was holding its collective breath, leaning forward in the shadows, hungry for the spectacle of a broken woman. Lyra lifted her chin, her eyes pale and clear, locked onto his with an intensity that made the massive Alpha King involuntarily shift his weight. She looked at the heavy velvet pouch of gold, resting on the silver platter beside the cup. The price of her quiet disappearance, the monetary value of her humiliation. I reject the gold, my king, Lyra said. Her voice was not loud, but the sheer lack of tremor in it carried it to the furthest, darkest corners of the hall. It was completely devoid of the hysterical grief they had all anticipated. It was empty. It was hollow. It was beautiful the way a blade was beautiful, and I accept the severance. She did not wait for his permission to move. She did not wait for the collective gasp that rippled through the 2,000 wolves who suddenly found themselves staring at a woman who possessed more dignity in her plain grey skirts than the entire noble council possessed in their silk robes. Lyra executed a perfect shallow curtsy, her spine remaining rigidly straight. She turned her back on the Alpha King, walked away from the vessel of her ruin, and began the long, agonizing walk down the center aisle of the grand hall. Vance's hand jolted, the silver cup rattling violently against his armor as a sudden, visceral shockwave of panic radiated from his rigid posture. His beast snarled, slamming against the forefront of his consciousness, demanding he drop the poison, demanding he run after her, demanding he drag her back to the dais and kneel. But the heavy iron doors of the cavernous chamber had already swung open, admitting a howling gust of freezing wind, and Lyra stepped out into the blackness of the courtyard, vanishing like smoke through a crack in the world. The heavy oak door of her modest quarters clicked shut, the iron latch dropping into place, with a sound of finality that echoed in the small freezing room. Lyra stood in the center of the braided rug, the darkness pressing in around her. For exactly 3 seconds, she allowed her human fortress to crack. She dropped to her knees, her hands flying to her chest as a ragged, tearless gasp tore its way up her throat. Her inner wolf was silent now. It had curled into a tight, dying ball in the furthest corner of her mind, numbed by the catastrophic trauma of the severed bond. Her collarbone was no longer burning. It had gone completely, terrifyingly numb, radiating a deep, bone-deep cold that made her teeth chatter uncontrollably. But survival did not allow for prolonged grief. The court expected her to pack her things slowly. They expected her to linger for days, weeping over old letters, hoping against hope that the king would realize his mistake and come down to the servant's wing to beg her forgiveness. They expected her to be a victim. Lyra forced herself to stand. The physical agony of moving was immense, her joints stiffening in rebellion, but she ignored the protests of her biology. She moved to the small stone wash basin in the corner of the room. From beneath the wooden floorboards, she retrieved a heavy glass jug containing her scent-stripping pine wash. It was a harsh, volatile mixture she had learned to make during her years in the lower scullery. A potent combination of raw white vinegar and bruised, deeply aromatic blue pine needles. It was designed to eradicate the smell of blood and sickness from the healing wards, but it was equally effective at erasing the biological signature of a wolf. She uncorked the jug. The sharp, acidic tang of the vinegar immediately stung her eyes, overriding the natural, lingering scent of her own distress. Lyra poured the freezing liquid over a coarse rag, her labor-hardened hands plunging into the icy dampness without hesitation. She began with the bed. Moving with a frantic, systematic precision, she stripped the woolen blankets and the linen sheets, tossing them into the roaring fireplace. She watched the fabric catch, the edges curling into black ash, sending the faint scent of her sleep up into the chimney and out into the night sky. Then she took the soaked rag and began to scrub the wooden bed frame. The vinegar burned fiercely as it seeped into the microscopic cuts and burns that crisscrossed her fingers from her years of apprenticing with the glass smiths. She welcomed the physical pain. It anchored her to the present. It drowned out the terrifying, echoing silence where the hum of Vance's soul had lived for the past 3 years. She scrubbed the wood until her knuckles were raw and bleeding, pressing the crushed needles into the grain to ensure absolutely nothing of her natural aroma remained. She moved to the stone walls, wiping down the masonry where she had leaned, the iron handles of the wardrobe she had touched, the back of the wooden chair where she had sat to brush her hair. She was meticulously, ruthlessly erasing a ghost. She knew how wolf biology worked. She knew that by morning, when the political adrenaline wore off and the horrifying reality of the severed bond set in, Vance's inner beast would drive him feral. He would come down to this room. He would tear the door off its hinges, desperate to bury his face in her pillows, desperate to inhale the lingering scent of rain and pine to soothe the agonizing withdrawal of the mate bond. Lyra refused to give him that comfort. He had chosen the court. He had chosen the Southern Treaty. He would not be allowed to feast on the remnants of her memory. When the room smelled of nothing but blinding, sterile vinegar and sharp, stinging pine sap, Lyra threw the rag into the fire. She moved to the small wooden chest at the foot of the bed. She did not touch the velvet gowns Vance had gifted her. She did not take the silver brushes or the delicate slippers meant for a queen. She dressed in her heaviest, most battered leathers. She pulled on a thick woolen sweater, wrapping a heavy, weather-beaten grey cloak around her shoulders. She strapped her heavy climbing boots to her feet, the thick iron treads designed for gripping ice, and loaded a single canvas satchel with dried meat, a flint, and her most precious possession, a heavy leather roll containing her specialized glass smithing tools. She stepped out of the room, leaving the door standing wide open to let the freezing corridor air sweep away any final traces of warmth. The stone corridors of the royal keep were largely deserted. The guards and the nobility were all congregated in the upper halls, drowning their discomfort in heavy wine and celebrating the new flawless alliance with Mariska Vane. Lyra kept to the shadows, moving with a silent, fluid grace that betrayed years of practice. Lyra was very good at being unseen. When you spent your life being told you were unworthy of taking up space, you learned how to walk without making a sound, how to breathe without moving your chest, how to exist as nothing more than a trick of the light against the stonework. She bypassed the main gates entirely, slipping through a narrow, frozen drainage grate that emptied out onto the steep, treacherous decline of the outer mountain wall. The moment she emerged from the protective architecture of the keep, the environment violently assaulted her. The wind was a physical blow, a solid wall of sub-zero pressure that immediately stole the breath from her lungs. She had stepped out into the foothills of the Obsidian Peaks, a lethal, towering mountain range known as the Hinterlands. It was a place of jagged, volcanic glass and deep, unmapped ravines where the blizzards never stopped, and the cold was aggressive enough to freeze the blood in a man's veins within hours. It was a suicide mission for a lone, unbonded wolf. Lyra pulled the heavy grey hood over her head, her handscars aching as the freezing air seeped through the leather of her gloves. The snow was already falling in massive, blinding sheets, instantly filling the indentations of her boots, ensuring that within minutes, not a single track would remain to show which direction she had gone. She looked back one final time. High above her, the warm, golden lights of the northern fortress glowed against the black sky, a bastion of safety and warmth that had just violently chewed her up and spit her out. We are small things in a world of teeth. She turned her back on the light, leaning her weight forward against the screaming force of the blizzard. She did not wait for the sun to rise. She did not wait for the king to realize the catastrophic magnitude of his mistake. She simply put one foot in front of the other, disappearing into the white void of the lethal mountains, a silent woman walking away from a crown she never asked for, carrying a survival instinct that was about to forge an empire of its own. The blizzard tore through the obsidian peaks with the malice of a conscious, vengeful entity. Every single stride Lyra Sterling took required a monumental, exhausting exertion of pure human will. The wind did not merely blow. It battered her wrapped figure with physical force, actively seeking the microscopic gaps in her heavy leathers to inject sub-zero venom directly into her bloodstream. The howling gale sounded like a chorus of dying beasts, drowning out even the ragged sound of her own breathing. Her heavy climbing boots, strapped with thick iron treads, crunched rhythmically against the shifting crust of black ice and snow. It was a monotonous, agonizing cadence that she forced herself to maintain. A forward push, a deep plunge into the drift, a heavy drag of her freezing limb. Her inner wolf offered absolutely no heat. Normally, a shifter's biology would flood their extremities with a protective, rapid-circulating thermal layer during extreme environmental exposure. But the phantom creature inside her remained tightly coiled in a death-like stupor, utterly devastated by the acidic severing of the mate bond. The space beneath her ribs, where Vance Ashwood's golden, resonant warmth had once anchored her soul, was now a gaping, freezing void. It radiated an internal, psychological winter that was far more lethal than the blizzard raging outside. She was bleeding from a wound no one could see. The scent-stripping pine wash she had used to meticulously erase her existence from the palace had long since frozen into the heavy fibers of her cloak, leaving her smelling of nothing but the sterile ice. Lyra forced her mind to focus entirely on the immediate tactile realities of her survival. The sting of flying ice crystals lashing against her exposed cheeks felt exactly like shattered glass tearing her skin. The heavy, abrasive friction of the canvas satchel cutting deeply into her collarbone provided a much-needed grounding pressure. The numbness creeping rapidly past her wrists, turning her labor-hardened hands into blocks of useless, unfeeling wood, was a biological warning she had no choice but to ignore. She could not halt. She would not halt. To halt was to surrender to the cold. And the stoic woman refused to be a convenient, forgotten casualty of the court's political machinations. For 3 days and 3 endless nights she climbed. She navigated the treacherous, unmapped ravines by pure, unadulterated instinct, her pale eyes tracking the subtle, yet dangerous shifts in the snowdrifts that indicated hidden crevices plummeting into nothingness. The jagged shards of volcanic glass buried beneath the powder slashed at her boots, actively trying to claim her to the mountain. She survived solely on rock-hard strips of dried meat, letting the salt thaw slowly against the roof of her mouth, and scooped handfuls of dirty snow to stave off severe dehydration. The bitter, metallic taste of the ice was a constant reminder of her isolation. She did not weep. She did not allow a single tear to fall. The moisture would only freeze her eyelids shut and blind her, making her an easy meal for the predatory snowcats that stalked the higher elevations. She moved through the white darkness like a ghost, a woman utterly detached from the opulent, treacherous world she had left behind. Every aching muscle in her calves, every raw blister forming on her heels, was a testament to her absolute refusal to break. On the dawn of the fourth day, the screaming wind abruptly shifted. The blinding white curtain of snow parted momentarily, revealing a jagged, bowl-shaped plateau nestled securely between two towering spires of black igneous rock, and there, cutting sharply through the sterile, odorless scent of frost was a harsh elemental aroma, sulfur, melted stone, deep ancient earth heat. The lone wanderer dragged her utterly exhausted body toward the center of the plateau. The snow aggressively thinned out here, replaced by warm, porous grey pumice. A massive geothermal vent tore straight through the crust of the mountain, venting a steady, roaring plume of superheated steam directly into the freezing air. The ambient temperature spiked violently within seconds. Within 10 paces of the deep fissure, the thick frost coating her heavy grey cloak began to rapidly melt, soaking into the rough wool with a heavy, wet weight that smelled of damp wood and pine. She collapsed to her trembling knees right at the edge of the steaming vent. She tore off her freezing leather gloves with her teeth. She held her raw, blue-tinged fingers out toward the rising, thick vapor. The sudden, extreme heat was agonizing, 1,000 tiny needles of pure fire pricking her deadened nerve endings as the sluggish blood was violently forced back into her extremities. She welcomed the intense physical pain. It was the undeniable pain of being alive. She closed her eyes, letting the heavy mineral-rich steam wash completely over her face, thawing the sharp icicles from her eyelashes and hair. Here, in the most inhospitable, lethal environment known to their kind, the violent earth had offered her a safe hearth. 6 months later, the remote plateau was no longer a barren, dangerous rock. It was a fortified sanctuary. Lyra had spent the agonizing spring hauling heavy timber up from the lower, distant tree line, meticulously constructing a sturdy, low-slung cabin directly over a secondary, smaller steam fissure. The thick wooden floorboards were permanently, wonderfully warm to the touch, providing a constant tactile relief to her bare feet. The air inside the cabin smelled richly of drying wild herbs, sweet wood smoke, and the sharp, metallic tang of molten minerals. She had fashioned racks for her provisions, secured heavy animal pelts for her bedding, and established a quiet, rhythmic domestic routine that demanded her absolute focus. But her true masterpiece, the core of her survival, was the forge. Constructed from meticulously stacked basalt and heavy river clay, the massive furnace harnessed the extreme, unregulated heat of the primary geothermal vent. It was a terrifying, roaring beast of contained fire that only she possessed the patience to tame. The master glass smith stood before it now, stripped down to a thin, sweat-soaked linen tunic, despite the high-altitude winter raging just outside her thick walls. Heavy droplets of sweat beaded along her collarbone, rolling right over the smooth, numb, unmarked scar where a royal claiming mark had once tried to form. She retrieved her specialized tools from the heavy leather roll she had carried up the mountain. The long iron blowpipe felt instantly familiar, an essential extension of her own arm. She dipped the heavy end into the glowing crucible of molten thermal obsidian, gathering a massive viscous glob of liquid fire. Turning the heavy pipe with a steady, practiced rhythm to prevent sagging, she carefully withdrew it from the roaring furnace. The brilliant orange light painted her focused face, casting sharp, dancing shadows against the cabin's wooden walls. Lyra brought the metal pipe to her chapped lips and exhaled, a slow, deeply controlled breath. The molten black glass expanded outward, glowing with an intense, mesmerizing internal luminance. She sat at her scarred wooden bench, using heavy steel jacks and wet wooden blocks to shape the fiery mass. Her movements were entirely hypnotic, fluid and utterly precise. She was not a rejected, discarded Omega here. She was not a lineageless maid waiting pathetically for the crumbs of a king's affection. She was a creator. She was the undisputed sovereign of her own quiet, warm empire. The thermal obsidian required immense, unrelenting focus. If it cooled too quickly in the ambient air, it shattered violently into deadly shrapnel. If it was worked too hot, it collapsed into a useless, smoking puddle. The artisan balanced the extreme temperatures flawlessly, her heavily scarred hands turning the pipe constantly, her clear, pale eyes calculating the exact viscosity of the glowing sphere. She was forging a geothermal focus lens, a thick, perfectly convex disc capable of trapping and magnifying ambient heat. It was an ancient, highly dangerous art that the modern pack below had entirely forgotten in their reliance on iron and magic. When the heavy lens was finally complete, she severed it from the pipe with a sharp tap of a cold iron file and placed it gently into the insulated annealing oven to cool slowly over the next entire week. She wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of her wrist, a quiet, profound sense of deep accomplishment settling firmly into her tired bones. The storm outside screamed against her reinforced roof, a constant reminder of the lethal world she had escaped. But inside her forge there was only light, heat, and absolute, untouchable independence. Year 3 of exile. For 3 continuous winters the snow had fallen without mercy, burying the world below in white. The high frost court was slowly, inevitably dying. It was not a quick, violent death brought on by a rival army's bloody claws, but a slow, suffocating environmental decay. The ambient temperature in the cavernous Grand Hall, once a deliberate, atmospheric chill designed to merely humble the pack, had plummeted into an unmanageable, bone-cracking freeze. Thick, white frost crept up the towering iron-wrought pillars like spidery, skeletal fingers, and the roaring hearth fires had dwindled to pathetic, sputtering embers that offered absolutely no comfort against the creeping darkness. Vance Ashwood stood silently at the massive stone war table, his enormous hands braced heavily against the frozen masonry. He was a mere shadow of the terrifying, physically dominant specimen he had been 3 years ago. The heavy crown of winter iron still rested it perfectly on his brow, but its jagged points seemed to weigh incredibly heavy, pressing so deeply into his pale skin that it left permanent dark bruises. His storm-grey eyes were entirely hollow, sunken deeply into sharp cheekbones that spoke of chronic, unrelenting physical exhaustion. His heavy fur mantle, once a symbol of his immense power, now hung loosely on his diminished frame. The physical deterioration of the Alpha King was a direct, inescapable biological consequence of the severed bond. He had expected the initial, violent shock of the ritual poison. He had expected a few weeks of restless, agonizing nights and a highly volatile inner beast. He had not expected the permanent, agonizing starvation of his very soul. His wolf paced endlessly in the dark, restrictive cage of his mind, snarling constantly at the empty space where his mate's quiet, steady hum should have been. It refused to settle. It refused to eat. It explicitly, violently refused to acknowledge Mariska Vane, the ambitious southern heiress who now permanently occupied the royal wing, smelling overpoweringly of poisoned honey and expensive orchids, was completely ignored by the starving beast that recognized only one true missing scent. Vance clenched his jaw, the muscle ticking furiously beneath his pale-drawn skin. He squeezed his eyes tightly shut, actively trying to suppress the phantom scent of fresh rain and crushed pine needles that ruthlessly haunted his every waking moment. The acidic wash she had used on her last night still mocked him, a lingering ghost in the royal chambers that no amount of scrubbing could erase. A name unspoken for 3 years grows teeth, my king, and Lyra Sterling's memory was slowly devouring him from the inside out, leaving nothing but a hollow shell wearing a crown. His hands, massive and scarred from countless territorial wars, trembled slightly as they gripped the stone. He was a sovereign who commanded thousands, yet he could not command the excruciating ache in his own chest to cease. The heavy oak doors of the chamber groaned loudly as they were pushed open, admitting a violent gust of grey, ash-tainted snow. Caelan Drake stepped into the freezing room, stamping his heavy, ice-caked boots aggressively against the flagstones. The chief engineer was a pragmatic, deeply observant man, his face weathered and lined by decades of maintaining the valley's intricate survival systems. He did not bow. There was absolutely no time for useless courtly formalities when the entire territory was teetering on the absolute brink of starvation. Caelan approached the stone table, unrolling a stiff, frost-rimed blueprint across the smooth surface. His movements were distinctly jerky, his fingers painfully stiff from the extreme environmental exposure outside the keep. The heavy parchment crackled loudly, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the deathly quiet hall. The Western heating wells have completely failed. The engineer's voice was grim, completely devoid of any attempt to soften the devastating blow. He tapped a heavily scarred, calloused finger against a complex grid map of the outer agricultural sector, tracing the dead lines where magical heat should have flowed. The iron heating grids are physically shattering under the topsoil. The pressure is immense. Whatever this rot is, it is not natural weather. The snow is falling black. It smells heavily of ash and southern rot. It is suffocating the soil, burying the winter wheat before it can even sprout. The king opened his hollow eyes, staring blankly at the map. His beast rumbled, a low, incredibly lethargic vibration deep in his chest. He knew the true source of the unnatural volcanic winter: Garrick Stone, the ruthless, ambitious usurper of the Southern Pack, the very man the political treaty with Mariska was supposed to keep safely at bay. Instead of securing lasting peace, the forced alliance had merely opened their northern borders to a slow, insidious magical infiltration. Garrick was using dark, weather-altering magic to force the northern court's complete submission, choking the valley until the proud sovereign would have no choice but to kneel and hand over the crown to save his people. "We have mobilized the fire seers," Vance said, his rumbling baritone carrying a rough, gravelly texture that spoke of long periods of absolute silence. "We have poured pure rendered fat directly into the secondary vents. The fires will not catch." "They won't," Kalen agreed, leaning heavily against the stone table to take the immense weight off his freezing legs, "because the iron grids are conducting the deadly cold instead of repelling it. The metal has been chemically compromised by the magical ash. Our conventional systems are entirely dead. The remaining crops in the lower valley will be permanently frozen in 6 days. The pups are already crying from the cold in the lower wards. The pack will starve by midwinter." The sovereign did not physically flinch. A ruler did not have the luxury of displaying panic. He simply stared at the thick frost, tracing delicate, spidery patterns across the blue ink of the blueprints. "Give me the alternative. You would not have walked up here merely to read me our death sentence." The older man hesitated, a rare, fleeting micro-gesture of true uncertainty crossing his weathered, stoic features. He looked at the bloodless knuckles of his king, deeply understanding the extreme physiological self-restraint required just to keep the massive, exhausted frame standing upright in the freezing room. "There is one theoretical solution," Kalen said slowly, his voice dropping into a tense, hushed register that barely carried over the howling wind outside. "If we cannot generate our own surface heat, we must harness the planetary core itself. We need to channel the raw, deep earth magma directly from the dormant fissures located miles beneath the valley." The monarch frowned, his brow furrowing deeply beneath the iron crown. "The iron pipes will melt instantly under that extreme pressure." "Not iron," the engineer corrected, tracing a circular, precise pattern on the map: glass, specifically geothermal focus lenses, massive precision-cut optical lenses forged from pure thermal obsidian. They can trap the ambient planetary heat and magnify it 1,000-fold, driving it safely through the dead grids to thaw the soil without shattering the conduits. It is the only material capable of withstanding the violent shift between the frozen surface and the boiling core. Vance's steely gaze narrowed slightly, a spark of analytical thought piercing his exhaustion. "Thermal obsidian is highly volatile. It requires a master glassmith to shape it, without it detonating and taking off their hands. Our guild masters were lost in the avalanche 2 winters ago. There is no one left in the territory who possesses that specialized skill." "Not entirely," Kalen murmured, his gaze dropping respectfully to the frozen floor. The silence in the cavernous room suddenly felt immensely heavy, suffocating. The air grew perceptibly thick. the ambient temperature seeming to drop another 10 degrees as the massive unspoken implication hung heavily between the two men. The Alpha King's heart slammed violently against his ribs. A sudden, massive jolt of adrenaline flooded his exhausted biological system, causing his dormant inner wolf to snap its massive head up in the dark, ears swiveling sharply forward. "Speak," the king commanded, the single, forceful word cracking like a physical whip through the freezing air. Kalen swallowed hard, his prominent Adam's apple bobbing above the thick fur collar of his coat. The Northern Scouts. They track the high-altitude weather patterns to predict the blizzards. For the past 2 entire years, they have reported seeing a consistent, deliberate plume of wood smoke rising from a remote plateau deep within the Obsidian Peaks. It is a functioning forge, my king, fashioned directly over a lethal, highly active geothermal vent. Vance gripped the edge of the stone table. The ancient masonry cracked audibly under the sheer, desperate force of his tightening fingers. The Obsidian Peaks, the blinding white void of the lethal mountains where a quiet, silent woman in a weather-beaten grey cloak had disappeared into the storm 3 years ago. The entire court had confidently assumed she was dead within the first 48 hours of exposure. No unbonded wolf could possibly survive that extreme altitude. No Omega without noble lineage could tame that violent wilderness. But his mate was not just a weak Omega. She was a creator. She had spent years quietly apprenticing with the old glass smiths in the damp lower scullery, her raw, labor-scarred hands learning the dangerous secrets of the flame, while the arrogant nobility mocked her complete lack of combat magic. The dungeons were where you went to be forgotten, but the high peaks were where you went to forge an absolute empire. "She is alive," Vance breathed, his voice barely a rough whisper. It was not a question. It was an absolute, instinctual, biological truth that hit him directly in the chest with the force of a physical blow. The frozen, agonizing void beneath his ribs suddenly flared to life, a desperate, maddening hunger clawing frantically at his insides, demanding immediate physical proximity. The chief engineer nodded slowly, respectfully keeping his eyes averted from the sudden, raw emotional vulnerability displayed openly on his ruler's face. "If anyone can forge the geothermal focus lens, my king, it is the woman we cast out into the ice." The journey into the lethal Obsidian Peaks was not a tactical royal expedition. It was a suicide march. Vance Ashwood left the heavy iron gates of the mountain stronghold entirely alone, actively refusing the armed royal escort that the chief engineer, Kalen Drake, had frantically attempted to assemble in the courtyard. A penitent man did not bring an army to beg for the salvation of his soul. He brought only his own fragile, rapidly deteriorating biology and the crushing weight of a guilt that had finally eroded his legendary stoicism. The transition from the lower valley to the towering hinterlands was a violent physical shock to his system. In the territory below, the magical black ash snow fell with a suffocating, unnatural heaviness. It smelled distinctly of rot, sulfur, and Garrick Stone's southern sabotage. The unnatural, volcanic frost was designed specifically to freeze the high frost valley, chemically compromising the iron heating grids and suffocating the life out of his people. Every dark flake that landed on Vance's shoulders felt like a parasite, draining the residual thermal energy from his heavy muscles. But as the desperate sovereign crossed the frozen tree line and began the brutal ascent into the jagged spires of the upper peaks, the dark magic of the usurper was instantly stripped away by the sheer, elemental fury of the ancient mountain itself. The wind here was a conscious, physical entity. It screamed across the black ice, a solid wall of sub-zero kinetic force that slammed continuously into his broad chest, actively trying to hurl his massive frame backward down the treacherous ravine. He dragged his heavy, ice-caked boots through thigh-deep drifts, his body shaking with uncontrollable, violent tremors. His inner wolf was completely useless to him now. Normally, an alpha of his terrifying lineage could instinctively summon a radiating aura of thermal energy, a biological furnace fueled by the immense power of his spirit to ward off environmental exposure. But the phantom beast, pacing in the dark, restrictive cage of his mind, was starving. It had not eaten, had not rested, and had not known a single moment of peace since the silver-rimmed dissolution cup had burned away its only anchor 3 years ago. The severed mate bond was a gaping, necrotic wound in his chest, bleeding his vital, instinctual warmth out into the howling blizzard. He was hollow. He was dying from the inside out, consumed by a generational curse of isolation that he had foolishly brought upon himself. He forced himself higher into the obsidian peaks, moving on blind, agonizing instinct. His bare hands gripped a protruding shelf of razor-sharp volcanic glass. The jagged edge sliced effortlessly through the thick calluses of his palm, but the freezing air cauterized the deep cut instantly, turning the fresh blood into dark, frozen ruby crystals against his pale skin. He did not feel the pain of the laceration. He only felt the agonizing, magnetic pull deep within his hollow ribs. It was a biological compass, a phantom tether dragging his exhausted, failing body upward through the blinding white void. For 2 days and 2 endless nights, the dying monarch climbed. He did not stop to sleep. To close his eyes was to invite the freezing death that stalked the high altitudes, but more terrifyingly, it was to invite the memory of pale, clear eyes looking at him with absolute, hollow acceptance in the center of the grand hall. The psychological torment of his guilt was far more lethal than the environmental exposure. Every time the shrieking wind dropped for a fraction of a second, his damaged mind hallucinated the faint, agonizing scent of fresh rain and bruised pine needles, the volatile pine wash she had used to erase her physical existence from the palace, still haunted his every breath, a ghostly reminder of the woman who had packed her life away in absolute silence before the sun had even risen. The phantom aroma would hit his lungs, causing his starving beast to hurl itself against the confines of his ribs, whimpering in a pitch of pure, instinctual desperation for a woman who was no longer there. He realized, with a suffocating wave of clarity, the catastrophic magnitude of his political arrogance. He had cast out the quiet, unseen foundation of his entire existence for a fragile treaty with Mariska Vane, an alliance that had ultimately brought nothing but black ash and death to his people. He had traded his fated soul for political leverage, believing love was a weakness the crown could not afford. Now, the entire valley was paying the price in blood and ice, and he was nothing more than a broken king crawling toward a ghost. By the dusk of the second day, his robust physiology began to undergo total systemic failure. His vision narrowed to a blurry grey tunnel, the edges bleeding into impenetrable darkness. The violent shivering abruptly stopped. It was the final, terrifying biological warning that his core temperature had plummeted past the point of autonomous recovery. His legs, thick as ancient tree trunks and scarred from countless territorial wars, finally gave out. He crashed heavily to his knees in the deep snow, his massive chest heaving as he tried to drag oxygen into lungs that felt entirely coated in sharp, expanding ice. He lowered his head, the heavy fur mantle providing absolutely no comfort against the crushing weight of his own regret. He was going to die here. The Alpha King, the terrifying sovereign who had sacrificed his true mate to secure an illusion of peace, was going to freeze to death alone on a nameless ridge. It was a fitting, pathetic end for a man who had chosen the coldness of a throne over the warmth of a fated bond. But as his chin rested against the frozen crust of the snowdrift, waiting for the final darkness to take him, a sudden microscopic shift in the atmosphere forced his sluggish eyes open. The sterile, odorless scent of the frost was abruptly pierced by a harsh, deeply elemental aroma, sulfur, melted stone, the raw, violent smell of deep earth heat. The exhausted ruler forced his head up, the frozen muscles in his neck screaming in protest. The howling blizzard was parting, swirling aggressively around a massive, bowl-shaped plateau nestled securely between 2 towering spires of black rock. And there, cutting through the eternal darkness of the lethal peaks, was a brilliant, pulsating aura of golden-orange light. It was a roaring plume of superheated steam venting continuously into the night sky from a massive geothermal vent. Vance began to crawl. He could no longer walk. so he dragged his failing body forward through the snow, his bloodied hands clawing desperately at the ice. With every agonizing inch he gained towards the center of the plateau, the ambient temperature spiked violently. The lethal frost coating his furs began to rapidly melt, soaking into the heavy wool with a sudden, overwhelming weight. The air here was dense, humid, and vibrating with the immense geological power of the mountain's core. He breached the perimeter of the warmth, dragging himself onto the porous grey pumice. His blurred, dying vision locked onto the source of the golden light. It was a sturdy, low-slung cabin constructed of heavy timber and basalt, built directly over a secondary steam fissure. It was a fortress of absolute safety in a world of absolute zero, an architectural marvel forged entirely from survival and sheer will. His massive, trembling hand reached out, his fingertips brushing the heavy wooden threshold of the door. He wanted to knock. He wanted to call out her name, to beg for a fraction of the mercy he had denied her. But the immense, overwhelming relief of the sudden heat finally shattered the last remaining pillar of his endurance. His turbulent eyes rolled back, and the terrifying, physically dominant sovereign of the North collapsed face first into the warm volcanic dust, sinking into heavy unconsciousness. The transition from the freezing abyss to sudden, overwhelming sensory density was jarring. The fallen king did not wake up slowly. His consciousness was violently slammed back into his body by a massive biological shockwave. Heat, absolute, radiating bone-deep heat. He inhaled sharply, his chest expanding with a ragged, desperate gasp. The air that rushed into his lungs was not the sterile, lethal ice of the mountain. It was impossibly warm, heavy, and thick, with a scent that instantly caused the starving beast inside his mind to thrash wildly against its cage. Wild herbs, sweet wood smoke, the sharp metallic tang of molten minerals, and beneath it all, completely unmasked and overwhelmingly pure, was the scent of fresh rain and crushed blue pine needles. His inner wolf let out a guttural, earth-shaking howl of recognition, a sound of such profound instinctual relief that Vance physically convulsed on the cot. His eyes snapped open, his storm-grey irises immediately shifting to a bright, molten gold as his beast desperately fought for dominance. He was lying on his back on a low, sturdy wooden bed. He was entirely stripped of his heavy, ice-caked furs and frozen armor, covered instead by a mound of exceptionally thick, dry animal pelts that trapped a magnificent layer of warmth against his violently shivering skin. The ambient temperature in the room was radically high, a perpetual summer generated by the massive, roaring basalt forge occupying the far wall. The agonizing pain of the thaw was severe, 1,000 needles of fire pricking his deadened nerve endings as the sluggish blood was violently forced back into his extremities. He turned his head, his neck joints cracking loudly in the quiet, heavily insulated space. She was sitting at a scarred wooden table across the room, Lyra Sterling. The absolute shock of her physical presence was a blunt force blow directly to his sternum. She was not the quiet, fragile maid who had stood in the center of the grand hall in plain grey skirts, absorbing the mockery of the nobility. For 3 continuous winters, the snow had fallen heavily on his deteriorating empire, marking the long years of her exile. The woman sitting 10 feet away from him was the undisputed sovereign of the flame. She wore a simple, sleeveless linen tunic, her skin glowing with a healthy, permanent flush from the extreme heat of the forge. Her dark hair was tied back tightly with a leather thong, and the sleeves of her tunic were rolled up, exposing the intricate, silvery network of new labor scars that crisscrossed her forearms and hands. She was holding a cold iron file, meticulously shaping the rough edges of a massive, perfectly convex disc of black glass, a geothermal focus lens. The very technology Kaelin Drake had frantically hypothesized could save the dying Western heating wells. He could not breathe. He simply stared, completely paralyzed by the sheer, devastating gravity of his own regret. He looked at the smooth, unmarked skin of her left collarbone, exposed by the loose collar of the tunic. There was no scar. The claiming mark he had so violently burned away with the corrosive liquid was completely gone. leaving absolutely no trace that he had ever belonged to her or she to him. The visual proof of his erasure was a physical blade sliding directly between his ribs, twisting slowly in the wound. "You are awake!" Her voice was not loud, but the sheer lack of tremor in it commanded the entire room. It was not the voice of a fated mate greeting her lost love after years of agonizing separation. It was entirely hollow, clinical, and completely detached from the monumental emotional chaos threatening to tear his mind apart. She did not look up from her work. The harsh, rhythmic rasp of the iron file against the glass continued without a single pause or hesitation. "Lyra," he whispered. His voice was a ruined, gravelly rasp, utterly broken by the freezing wind and the agonizing dehydration. She carefully set the heavy file down on the wooden bench, wiping her calloused hands deliberately on a thick canvas cloth. She stood, turning to face him, her pale, clear eyes locked onto his molten gold ones, and the absolute stillness of her gaze made the massive man involuntarily shrink back against the pillows. There was no anger in her face. There was no vindictive triumph, no lingering grief, and absolutely no affection. She looked at him with the cold, professional assessment of a master artisan evaluating a stranger who had stumbled blindly into her shop. She walked to the small stone hearth, pouring a steaming measure of dark broth from an iron kettle into a wooden cup. She carried it over to the cot, but she did not sit on the edge of the mattress. She did not reach out to touch his pale, sweating forehead. She placed the cup deliberately on the small wooden stool beside the bed, ensuring a strict, physical boundary remained firmly established between them. "Drink the broth," the stoic woman commanded quietly. "Your core temperature is dangerously unstable. The marrow will force the blood to resume normal circulation before the frostbite reaches the bone." Vance ignored the cup. His massive, trembling hand reached out from beneath the heavy pelts, desperate to bridge the agonizing physical distance. He needed to touch her. His failing biology was screaming for it, demanding the tactile reassurance that she was real, that the severed bond could somehow be miraculously rewoven through simple skin-to-skin contact. His scarred fingers stretched blindly toward her wrist. The artisan did not flinch away. She simply took exactly one half-step backward, her spine perfectly straight, watching his hand fall empty onto the warm floorboards. The movement was so graceful, so utterly devoid of panic or emotional reaction, that it shattered him more completely than a scream would have. The public severing was intended to shatter her spirit. When he had handed her the silver-rimmed dissolution cup in front of 2,000 silent wolves, he had truly believed the political execution would break her into 1,000 irreparable pieces. He had expected her to weep, to beg, to collapse. But looking at her now, anchored entirely in her own immense power and radiating quiet authority, Vance realized his catastrophic arrogance. The fire had not destroyed her. It had merely burned away the fragile, accommodating facade to reveal a woman composed entirely of thermal obsidian. "Lyra, please," the sovereign begged, the terrifying ruler dropping all pretense of authority. His massive chest heaved, a ragged, tearless sob tearing its way up his throat. He forced his battered body upward, sliding off the edge of the cot until his bare knees hit the warm wooden floorboards. He was kneeling. The Alpha King was kneeling in the dirt at the feet of the woman he had discarded, his broad shoulders shaking with the sheer force of his psychological collapse. "I am sorry. By the gods, I am so deeply, unimaginably sorry." She looked down at the weeping man. Her inner wolf, which had curled into a tight, dying ball 3 years ago when he severed their sacred thread, remained absolutely silent. It was deeply buried behind a massive fortress of psychological iron. She felt absolutely nothing for the pathetic, starving beast thrashing in his golden eyes. "The Alpha King does not kneel in my forge," Lyra stated, her tone flat and uncompromising. "You are tracking melting ice onto my floorboards, and the humidity interferes with the annealing process." He recoiled as if she had struck him across the face with a heavy blade. The profound, impenetrable coldness of her demeanor was suffocating. He had expected her to yell, to strike his chest, to demand bloody retribution for the public humiliation he had subjected her to. He knew how to handle violence. He had spent his entire life fighting wars, but he did not know how to fight absolute, silent apathy. "The valley is dying," he choked out, grasping desperately for the political reality that had driven him up the mountain, hoping to find a shred of the compassionate healer he once knew in the lower wards. Garrick Stone, the southern pack. They triggered a magical black ash snow. "The iron heating grids are shattered. The crops are dead," Kaelan said. "Kaelan said you were the only one." Lyra slowly pivoted away from him, walking quietly back to the scarred wooden bench. She picked up the heavy iron file, her labor-hardened hands resuming their precise, rhythmic work against the black glass. She was establishing the absolute undeniable reality of their new dynamic. She was a master of the high peaks now, not used, not owned, chosen entirely by her own fierce will to survive. "Kaelan Drake is a pragmatic engineer, and he is correct," she said, not bothering to look over her shoulder at the kneeling monarch. "I possess the skill to forge the geothermal focus lenses required to channel the deep earth magma and save your dying territory." Vance let out a shuddering breath of profound relief, his heavy head dropping forward in a gesture of total submission. "Thank you. I swear to you, I will make amends. I will drag Mariska out of the keep by her hair. I will give you the crown. I will atone for every day you spent in this ice. You misunderstand the nature of this transaction." "My king," Lyra interrupted, her voice slicing cleanly through his desperate, frantic promises. The honorific was delivered without a single ounce of reverence. It was a cold, clinical label applied to a stranger. They were merely fragile creatures in a realm of fangs, and she had spent 3 years sharpening hers on volcanic rock. She paused her filing, turning her head just enough to fix him with a chilling, pale stare. "There is no us. There is no crown waiting for me in a court that stood silently while I was burned. You are a sovereign facing the catastrophic failure of his infrastructure, and I am the only independent contractor on this continent holding the materials you require." Vance Ashwood remained planted on the warm wooden floorboards, his broad shoulders bowed under the crushing weight of her absolute detachment. The Alpha King, a man who had slaughtered rival warlords, bathed his hands in the blood of usurpers, and bent entire territories to his iron will, was completely paralyzed by the sheer apathy in the eyes of his fated mate. He had expected rage. He had prepared his chest to receive her blows, to absorb her hatred, to let her scream until her lungs gave out. But this clinical evaluation was an impenetrable fortress he possessed no weapons to breach. She looked at him not as a tragic lover, nor even as a despised enemy, but as a cold calculation. The beast inside his chest scratched frantically at his ribs, howling in a pitch of pure agony that only he could hear. It was a suffocating, violent grief. "A contract," the kneeling man whispered, the words scraping painfully against his parched throat. His steely eyes flickered with a desperate, dying light, seeking any fragment of the quiet warmth she used to offer him. "Lyra, you ask for a trade. My life, the lives of my pack for glass. I will give you anything. The royal vaults, the southern territories, my own life. I have no use for your gold, and I certainly have no use for your life," she replied, maintaining that even, unyielding cadence. She did not raise her pitch. She did not display a single micro-expression of triumph. The cruel ritual of their severing was meant to leave her in ruins. When he had forced her to drink from the lethal goblet before the High Court, everyone had expected her to shatter. Yet here she stood, entirely whole, while the sovereign shattered at her feet. "What I require is legally binding autonomy, but you are currently in no mortal state to sign a decree, and I do not make verbal agreements with monarchs who break sacred bonds when it suits their political agenda." Before the ruined ruler could muster the breath to reply, a sudden, violent thud echoed against the heavy iron-reinforced door of the cabin. The sound was distinct from the rhythmic battering of the blizzard. It was a frantic, desperate pounding, a physical assault on the thick timber that threatened to splinter the wood. Lyra's pale eyes darted toward the entrance, but her posture remained impeccably relaxed. She did not scramble for a weapon. She did not bare her teeth. She merely picked up a thick woolen cloth, wiping the volcanic dust from her scarred hands, and walked deliberately past the weeping monarch. She lifted the heavy iron latch and hauled the thick door inward. A wall of shrieking, sub-zero wind immediately invaded the sanctuary, carrying with it a chaotic swirl of lethal white frost and the chemical sting of magical black ash snow. The biting cold was a physical weapon, slashing at the intense, trapped heat of the forge. Collapsed across the wooden threshold was Cailan Drake. The chief engineer was entirely encased in a thick shell of ice, his lips blue and his breathing a horrifying wet rattle that spoke of deep tissue hypothermia. Secured tightly around his broad chest was a set of heavy leather harnesses, anchoring him to a massive ironwood transport sled resting just outside in the pumice. Cailan was a pragmatic man. He knew that a king blinded by the agony of a severed bond would not have the practical foresight to bring a vehicle capable of safely transporting massive, fragile glass lenses down a lethal mountain. He had followed his sovereign into the abyss, and the mountain had nearly claimed him. Lyra grabbed the heavy collar of the engineer's frozen coat and hauled him inside with a sudden shocking display of physical strength. Her muscles, honed by 3 years of unyielding manual labor, easily dragged the large man across the floor. She kicked the heavy door shut, instantly cutting off the shrieking gale and plunging the room back into its dense, superheated acoustic warmth. Cailan fell onto his hands and knees on the floorboards, coughing violently as the extreme heat of the forge hit his frozen lungs. He gasped for oxygen, his weathered face contorted in the agonizing pain of the sudden thaw. The rapid temperature shift sent thousands of screaming needles through his frostbitten nerves. As his blurry vision slowly cleared, he lifted his heavy head to assess his surroundings. The older man froze. The frantic, ragged sound of his breathing hitched, then stopped entirely. There, just a few paces away, was Vance Ashwood, the supreme ruler of the hinterlands, the terrifying primal apex of their kind. He was stripped of his heavy plate armor, shivering violently in thin, sweat-soaked linen, kneeling on the floor with his head bowed and his face tracked with silent, continuous tears, and standing over him, radiating an aura of absolute, untouchable authority, was the woman the entire court had mocked and discarded. The shock on Cailan's face was absolute, a visceral disbelief that widened his eyes and rendered him completely mute. But Lyra did not allow the silence to stretch into a theatrical spectacle. She did not gloat. She simply stepped over the pooling water, melting from the engineer's heavy coat, and walked toward the small stone hearth. "Strip your outer layers, Cailan," the master glass-smith commanded. It was not a request. It was an absolute directive spoken with the weight of gravity. Hang the coat by the secondary vent. If the moisture seeps into the floorboards, it will warp the wood and ruin my hearth's foundation. Drink the broth on the table. It is steeped in blue pine and bone marrow. The chief engineer swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically between the kneeling king and the stoic artisan. He fumbled with his frozen buckles, his stiff, trembling fingers struggling to obey the desperate signals from his brain. He managed to shed the ice-caked leather, accepting the steaming wooden cup she pushed into his scarred hands. The sharp metallic tang of the broth instantly cleared his head, sending a wave of aggressive heat spreading rapidly through his chest. "My lady," Cailan rasped, his voice rough and incredibly small in the presence of such monumental tension. I brought the sled. For the lenses, the valley. The black ash is compounding. We have 3 days before the western wards freeze permanently. The people are dying in their beds. "I am aware of the timeline," she stated flatly. She turned her back on the two men, walking deliberately toward a heavy iron lockbox secured beneath her massive scarred workbench. She retrieved an ancient iron key from a leather cord around her neck, unlocking the heavy lid with a sharp, echoing click that sounded like a gunshot in the tense air. From the depths of the safe, she extracted a thick, perfectly preserved roll of cured vellum, an inkhorn carved from bone, and a long, sharp quill. She carried the items to the main table, sweeping aside a scattering of charcoal sketches and heavy iron measuring calipers. She unrolled the thick parchment, pinning the curling corners down with smooth blocks of cooled obsidian. "Stand up, my king," Lyra said. She did not look at him. She merely uncorked the black ink. Vance flinched at the hollow, formal title. It was a verbal blade, twisting in his gut. He forced his massive, trembling frame to obey, his muscles screaming in violent protest as he dragged himself up from the floorboards. He swayed dangerously, his storm-grey eyes sunken and heavily bruised, looking entirely hollowed out by the sheer force of his psychological devastation. Blood seeped from the cracked skin of his frostbitten lips, yet he did not move to wipe it away. He took a slow, agonizing step toward the table, leaning heavily on the rough wooden edge just to remain upright. Cailan immediately stepped forward, reaching out to offer his arm, but the Sovereign waved the engineer away with a sharp, erratic jerk of his wrist. He would not be pitied in front of his mate. "This is a binding territorial contract," Lyra began, her voice crisp, clear, and entirely devoid of inflection. She dipped the quill in the deep black ink, handing it handle first to Cailan. "You are the chief engineer, an acting representative of the Noble Council, and a recognized state witness. You will draft the terms exactly as I dictate them, establishing the conditions for the formal sovereign treaty to be signed publicly once the valley thaws. But your sovereign will seal this preliminary contract now with his blood and iron." Cailan looked at Vance. The Alpha King gave a single slow, defeated nod, his gaze never leaving the sharp, beautiful profile of the woman who was systematically dismantling his vast empire piece by piece. "The first condition," Lyra dictated, pacing slowly in front of the roaring furnace, the golden light painting her pale skin in hues of fire and embers. "The geothermal plateau, extending to the outer ridges of the obsidian peaks, is hereby declared an independent, sovereign territory. It is entirely exempt from the laws, tithes, and military drafts of the High Frost Court. My land is my own." The sharp quill scratched loudly against the rough vellum. The sound was deafening in the quiet cabin, a permanent carving of consequence. Every scrape of the iron nib against the cured skin felt like a lash across the king's bare back, etching his permanent failure into the annals of their history. "The second decree," she continued, stopping to look directly into the molten gold eyes of the starving beast trapped inside the king. "Any physical entry into this territory by a member of the royal pack, without my explicit written consent, will be considered an act of war and met with immediate lethal force." Vance's jaw clenched so tightly a loud pop echoed in the small room. He was holding his breath again, his massive chest perfectly still, actively fighting the overwhelming instinctual urge to leap across the table, pin her to the timber wall, and beg her to rip his throat out rather than exile him from her presence. But he remained completely frozen, his knuckles turning entirely white where he gripped the edge of the wood. "The final term," she said, her voice dropping a fraction of an octave, taking on a heavy, chilling gravity that made the hairs on Cailan's arms stand up. "The Crown officially, permanently, and irrevocably agrees to nullify any past, present, or future claims upon Lyra Sterling once the formal treaty is enacted. This includes claims of lineage, claims of citizenship, and claims of biological mating rights. Not used, not owned. Chose entirely by my own autonomy." A jagged, tearing sound ripped from Vance's massive chest. It was a sob he could not suppress, a raw manifestation of the generational curse of isolation, finally locking its iron jaws completely around his throat. To sign away the mating rights was to legally, permanently close the door on any hope of redemption. It was a formal acknowledgement that he had murdered their fated bond on that cold iron days, and that no amount of kneeling, no amount of bleeding would ever resurrect it. "Write it," the monarch gritted out, his voice a horrifying, demonic rasp that made Cailan physically flinch backward. The chief engineer's hand trembled violently as he etched the devastating words into the parchment, the black ink stark and permanent against the pale, cured vellum. When the writing was complete, Lyra stepped forward. She did not offer the king the quill. She did not offer him comfort. Instead, she retrieved a heavy stick of red sealing wax and held it near the open door of the roaring, annealing oven. The wax softened instantly under the immense heat. She let a thick, crimson pool drip onto the bottom of the contract, the color exactly mimicking the shade of freshly spilled blood. She looked at the sovereign, her silver eyes like frozen glass. "Your seal." Vance lifted his right hand. The heavy iron signet ring of the Alpha King rested on his index finger. Cold, heavy, and unyielding, he stared at the red wax. It looked exactly like the wound in his chest felt, hot, bleeding, and raw. He slowly, agonizingly pressed the heavy iron ring into the molten pool. The heat of the wax hissed sharply against the cold metal, releasing a sharp, acrid wisp of smoke that smelled faintly of burning pine. He held it there for 3 agonizing seconds, ensuring the intricate impression of the winter wolf was perfectly, immaculately carved into the seal. Then he pulled his trembling hand away. The contract was absolute. It was legally binding. He had just formally banished himself from the only sanctuary his fractured soul had ever known. Lyra reached out and calmly rolled up the heavy parchment. She did not thank him. She did not smile. She simply placed the legal document back into the iron lockbox and turned the heavy key, sealing his doom in the darkness. "The negotiation is concluded," the stoic artisan announced. She turned her back on the broken king and the stunned engineer, walking purposefully toward the massive basalt furnace that dominated the rear of the room. "Rest on the cots. Your core temperatures are still dangerously compromised. I must begin the forging process immediately if you wish to save your valley before the next blizzard hits." The forge was a terrifying beast of contained fire, an elemental monstrosity that required absolute, unwavering dominance to control. The ambient temperature in the workspace was radically high, a perpetual, suffocating summer that stood in violent contrast to the lethal, freezing void raging just inches beyond the thick wooden walls. Vance Ashwood retreated to the low cot, pulling the heavy, coarse animal pelts over his violently shivering frame. But he did not lie down. He could not. His clouded gaze was locked in a desperate, unblinking stare, entirely captivated by the woman moving gracefully through the golden, pulsating light. Lyra Sterling was not merely working. She was executing a deeply sacred, highly dangerous ritual. She stood before the massive crucible of molten thermal obsidian, her bare arms glistening with a heavy layer of sweat. She tied a thick leather apron over her linen tunic, the heavy material scarred, pitted, and scorched by countless near misses with liquid fire. She retrieved her long, heavy iron blowpipe, her labor-hardened hands gripping the metal with a familiarity that spoke of years of solitary, agonizing practice. The king watched her every micro-gesture. He watched the way her lean muscles shifted beneath her skin, powerful and fluid, forged not in the safety of a royal training yard, but in the brutal, uncompromising arena of sheer survival. He noticed the silvery, intricate network of burns that crisscrossed her knuckles. Each scar was a permanent record of a mistake, a lesson learned in agonizing pain, a testament to the days she had spent alone, bleeding and burning while he sat comfortably on his throne beside Mariska Vane. The guilt was a physical crushing weight against his sternum. He had thrown her into the ice to die, believing her entirely useless to the crown, because she lacked the violent combat magic of the noble elite. Yet here she was, commanding the raw, violent blood of the mountain itself. She had tamed the volcano. She did not need a pack. She did not need a king. She was an absolute empire of one. Lyra thrust the heavy iron pipe deep into the glowing crucible. The liquid thermal obsidian was an incredibly volatile substance. If it was worked too hot, it would collapse into a useless, smoking puddle. If it cooled too rapidly in the ambient air, the extreme thermal shock would cause it to violently detonate, sending lethal shards of black glass tearing through flesh and bone. It required a master's absolute, flawless synchronization with the earth. She withdrew the pipe, gathering a massive viscous glob of glowing, golden-black magma on the end. The intense heat radiating from the glass was palpable even from the cot, a wave of sheer, aggressive energy that made the air physically shimmer and warp. She brought the pipe to her chapped lips. She closed her pale eyes, her chest expanding deeply, and exhaled, a slow, incredibly controlled breath. The molten glass expanded, forming a perfect glowing sphere of trapped fire. She moved swiftly to the scarred wooden bench, rolling the heavy pipe back and forth with a steady, rhythmic cadence. She used thick, water-soaked wooden blocks to shape the exterior of the sphere, the wet wood screaming and violently hissing as it made contact with the superheated glass, sending thick, blinding plumes of white steam into the dry air. Vance's beast whimpered in the dark, restrictive cage of his mind. The phantom wolf was completely mesmerized by her scent. Even through the ash and the sweat, the sharp, metallic tang of the molten minerals mixed perfectly with the sweet wood smoke and the underlying pure aroma of fresh rain. It was the scent of a true Luna, a woman who possessed the immense quiet strength to nurture life in the most hostile environment imaginable. He had possessed her once. He had held her in his massive arms in the quiet hours of the night, feeling the soft, hesitant hum of her soul pressing against his. Now he was reduced to a pathetic spectator, watching her brilliance from behind a strict physical boundary he was legally forbidden to cross. She worked in absolute unbroken silence, hour after agonizing hour. The rhythmic rasp of the iron file, the violent hiss of the wet wooden blocks, and the deep, rumbling roar of the furnace filled the cabin. The scent-stripping pine wash she had used so meticulously to erase her existence from the palace's walls 3 years ago was replaced entirely by the scent of pure creation. She did not show a single sign of fatigue. Her posture remained impeccably straight, her focus incredibly sharp. She was forging massive, perfectly convex discs, the geothermal focus lenses that would soon be installed in the dying western heating grids of the high frost court. As she severed the fourth heavy lens from the pipe with a precise, ringing tap of cold iron, Cailan Drake let out a low, involuntary breath of sheer professional awe. The chief engineer was a master of his craft, but he was currently watching an art form that had been entirely lost to their kind for generations. The curvature, Cailan murmured, leaning forward from his stool, his weathered face bathed in the orange light. It is flawlessly aligned. The ambient heat of the earth will trap entirely within the center node. It will magnify the flame by 1,000-fold, my lady. This is impossible without magical intervention. Lyra used heavy iron tongs to gently transfer the glowing lens into the heavily insulated annealing oven, securing the thick door to allow the glass to cool slowly over the coming days. She wiped her brow with the back of her forearm, leaving a dark streak of soot against her pale skin. Magic is a crutch for those who refuse to understand the nature of the physical world, she replied coldly, her voice echoing in the dense air. The noble council relies on illusions and weather manipulation because it requires no discipline. The mountain requires discipline. The fire requires blood. That is why your southern treaty failed, and that is why your valley is currently rotting under Garrick Stone's magical black ash snow. She turned, her clear silver eyes fixing directly on the Alpha King. The sudden, intense eye contact was a massive jolt to Vance's shattered nerves, sending a violent shudder through his spine. You traded the foundational stability of your pack for the superficial leverage of a southern heiress, Lyra stated. Her tone was entirely devoid of vindictiveness, delivering the brutal truth with the clinical precision of a surgeon, amputating a gangrenous limb. Mariska Vane brought you an army, but she also brought the poison that is currently suffocating your crops. You built your empire on the expectation of violence, my king, and you entirely ignored the quiet, unseen labor that kept your hearths burning. Vance closed his eyes, a ragged, shuddering breath escaping his lungs. Every single word was a jagged blade tearing through his conscience. She was absolutely right. He had been so entirely blinded by the strategic necessity of border defense that he had failed to see the slow, insidious rot spreading from within his own inner circle. He had cast out the woman who possessed the true unyielding strength of the earth, choosing instead a woman composed entirely of poisoned honey and empty promises. I was blind, the Sovereign whispered, his deep baritone barely audible over the crackling flames. He opened his eyes, the molten gold of his inner beast bleeding back into the storm-grey irises. He looked at her not with the arrogant entitlement of a ruler, but with the profound, desperate vulnerability of a starving man begging for a single crumb of grace. I allowed the council's fear to dictate my actions. I'd allowed the ancient laws to overrule my own instinct. I will spend the rest of my miserable existence paying for that arrogance. But I swear to you, Lyra, when these lenses are installed, the southern influence will be eradicated. I will strip Mariska of her titles. I will hang Garrick Stone from the iron pillars of the Grand Hall. Lyra walked to the small stone basin, splashing freezing water over her soot-stained face. She grabbed a coarse woolen towel, drying her skin with slow, deliberate motions. "You will do what you must to secure your borders, Vance," she said. The use of his given name, completely stripped of any honorific or affection, was far more devastating than a physical blow. But do not make those promises to me. I am no longer a subject of the High Frost Court. I do not care who sits on your throne, nor do I care who swings from your pillars. My only concern is that your engineer carefully transports this cargo down my mountain without shattering my hard work. She tossed the towel onto the scarred bench and walked toward a small, shadowed alcove near the back of the cabin, separated by a heavy, hanging woolen curtain. The final lenses will be cooled and ready for transport by tomorrow morning, the master artisan announced, her back turned to them. You will sleep tonight. At first light, you will load the sled, you will leave my territory, and you will never return. The heavy curtain fell shut behind her, swallowing her completely in the shadows. The cabin was plunged into a suffocating silence, broken only by the crackle of the massive furnace and the howling blizzard outside. Caelan Drake stared at the floorboards, deeply uncomfortable, acutely aware that he was bearing witness to the absolute, humiliating destruction of a king's soul. Vance Ashwood lay back against the coarse animal pelts, his massive frame trembling violently. The physical frostbite was slowly retreating from his limbs, but the psychological freeze was permanent. He stared at the heavy woolen curtain, the agonizing scent of fresh rain and crushed blue pine needles hanging heavily in the superheated air. The sound of the iron lockbox clicking shut echoed in his mind, securing the rolled vellum of the binding territorial contract in total darkness. The rhythmic, suffocating roar of the forge consumed the remaining hours of the night. He had come to the Obsidian Peak seeking salvation, but all he had found was a beautiful, untouchable ghost made entirely of fire and glass. Narrative ledger. The physical state of Lyra's severed mating mark remained entirely dormant, a hollow, frozen patch of scarred tissue resting over her collarbone that refused to warm even with her former mate, breathing the same superheated air. The physical proximity of the tracker was now absolute zero. The sovereign of the hinterlands, trapped within the very walls of her sanctuary, agonizingly close yet separated by an impenetrable legal chasm, and the measurable level of the king's guilt torment registered as absolute ruin, a catastrophic, suffocating hemorrhage of the soul, as his inner wolf finally realized the bond it had publicly slaughtered could never be resurrected. He would rule his kingdom, but he would do so entirely alone. As the long night bled into a pale, freezing dawn, the heavy quietness of the signed pledge pressed down on the king like a physical weight, giving way only to the urgent necessity of the morning. The descent from the geothermal plateau was a grueling, methodical exercise in sheer endurance. Lyra Sterling did not ride upon the heavy ironwood transport sled. Despite the chief engineer's repeated, respectful offers to share the insulated cargo space, the master glass-smith chose to walk beside the massive runners, her heavy climbing boots crunching rhythmically through the deep, treacherous powder. She moved with the fluid, silent grace of a predator, deeply attuned to its environment, her pale eyes constantly tracking the subtle shifts in the wind that threatened the fragile, priceless cargo strapped beneath Caelan Drake's heavy leather harnesses. Lyra was very good at being unseen, a phantom of the high peaks wrapped in a weather-beaten grey cloak, blending perfectly into the white void of the blizzard. But today, her quiet presence carried the monumental weight of an entire kingdom's survival. Vance Ashwood marched at the vanguard, his massive frame breaking the heavy snowdrifts to clear a path for the sled. The Alpha King was no longer the dying, hollowed-out shell that had collapsed outside her forge. The intense, superheated acoustic warmth of the cabin, combined with the marrow-rich blue pine broth, had violently kick-started his robust physiology. The frostbite had retreated, leaving his sharp cheekbones and heavily scarred jawline flushed with raw, aggressive thermal energy. Yet beneath the restored physical dominance, the psychological devastation remained absolute. His storm-grey eyes constantly flicked back toward the stoic woman walking beside the sled, his inner wolf whimpering in the dark, restrictive cage of his mind. The phantom beast was agonizingly aware of her proximity, driven to near madness by the sharp, metallic tang of molten minerals and the pure, underlying aroma of fresh rain and shattered pine. But he did not reach for her. The binding territorial contract, sealed in his own blood and iron, was a physical chain wrapped tightly around his throat, demanding absolute, horrifying restraint. When the small procession finally breached the lower tree line and entered the outer boundaries of the high frost valley, the atmosphere shifted with violent, unnatural abruptness. The howling, elemental fury of the mountain wind died instantly, replaced by a suffocating, stagnant dead zone. The sky above the agricultural sector was a bruised, sickly purple, weeping a continuous, heavy curtain of magical black ash snow. It smelled overwhelmingly of sulfur, rotting vegetation, and the distinct cloying sweetness of poisoned honey. The western heating wells, a sprawling network of massive iron grates embedded into the permafrost, were entirely entombed in a thick, necrotic shell of dark ice. Standing at the edge of the frozen grids, surrounded by a heavy escort of southern mercenaries, was Garrick Stone. The usurper of the southern pack wore a thick mantle of dyed black wolf fur, his sharp, cruel features twisted into a mask of supreme arrogance. He was flanked closely by Mariska Vane. The ambitious heiress was draped in pristine silver silks that seemed entirely untouched by the falling ash. A polite, frozen smile plastered across her flawless face as she watched the dying monarch approach. They had waited for this exact moment. They had orchestrated the slow, environmental strangulation of the valley, expecting Vance to return from the lethal peaks completely broken, ready to formally surrender his crown and his sovereignty to save his starving people. "You have survived the ice, my king," Mariska projected, her voice dripping with a false, saccharine relief that made Vance's inner beast snarl violently. She took a delicate step forward, the overwhelming scent of expensive southern orchids completely masking the rot beneath her boots. "We feared the mountain had claimed you. The valley is failing rapidly. The iron is shattered. It is time to sign the integration treaty. My father's southern heating mages are waiting at the border, ready to clear this terrible weather the moment you yield the northern command to Garrick." Vance did not answer her. He did not even look at the woman who had occupied his royal wing for 3 agonizing years. His massive hands clenched into tight fists, the knuckles turning entirely bloodless as he actively reined in the primal, biological urge to tear her throat out. He stepped aside, his broad shoulders parting like massive iron doors to reveal the heavy transport sled and the quiet, unassuming woman standing perfectly still beside it. Garrick's cruel smile faltered slightly, his dark eyes narrowing as he registered the presence of the outcast. The entire court had been explicitly informed that the lineageless Omega had perished in the blizzards years ago. Yet here she stood, her spine impeccably straight, her labor-hardened hands resting casually on the thick leather straps of the sled. "Kaelin," Lyra commanded, her voice cutting through the thick, toxic air with the unyielding clarity of a striking blade. She completely ignored the southern nobility, treating them with the exact same clinical detachment she reserved for common debris. "Unbind the harnesses. The ambient temperature of the black ash is compounding. If the thermal obsidian experiences a rapid thermal drop before installation, The internal tension will cause the lenses to detonate. The chief engineer moved with frantic, highly disciplined precision. He tore the leather straps away, exposing the 4 massive, perfectly convex discs of glowing black glass. The intense heat radiating from the geothermal focus lenses was immediately palpable, a wave of sheer, aggressive energy that made the toxic air physically shimmer and warp around the sled. "What is this?" Garrick demanded, his voice losing its smug, polished veneer, replaced by a sharp edge of genuine panic. He stepped forward, his hands twitching as the dark, weather-altering magic in his veins instinctively recoiled from the pure elemental heat. "Alpha King, I demand you halt this immediately. You are violating the terms of our proposed treaty. Tear the primary grates open," Vance roared, his deep baritone echoing like a thunderclap across the frozen fields. 24 of the King's loyal northern guards, who had been shivering desperately at the perimeter, surged forward. Grabbing heavy iron crowbars, they wedged the metal beneath the thick, frost-rimed grates of the western wells and hauled backward with a synchronized, guttural shout. The ice screamed, a high-pitched, tearing sound as the heavy covers were violently ripped away, exposing the deep, dormant earth fissures plunging miles into the darkness below. The sound of tearing ice echoed across the courtyard, a violent, high-pitched scream that finally shattered the frozen stagnation of the valley. Lyra did not hesitate. She pulled her heavy, scorched leather apron over her grey cloak and retrieved her specialized iron tongs. "Guide the descent," she ordered Kalen, her pale eyes locking onto the exact geometric center of the primary fissure. Together, the master artisan and the engineer hoisted the first immense lens. The thermal obsidian hummed, a deep, resonant vibration that could be felt in the marrow of the bone. With flawless, agonizingly precise coordination, they lowered the thick convex disc directly into the reinforced iron housing above the deep earth vent. The reaction was instantaneous. The moment the thermal obsidian locked into the grid, it tapped directly into the raw planetary core miles beneath the surface. The black glass flared with a blinding, pulsating golden luminance. It trapped the rising magma heat, magnifying it 1,000-fold, and forced the superheated energy directly into the heating grids of his sovereign domain. A gigantic, concussive shockwave of pure thermal energy exploded outward from the wells. The ground violently shuddered. The heavy iron grids, which had been chemically compromised and brittle, suddenly glowed bright orange, conducting the intense heat without shattering. The suffocating, necrotic shell of dark ice, entombing the fields, instantly vaporized into thick, blinding clouds of white steam. The cursed dark precipitation did not merely melt, it was violently eradicated. As the intense, radiating summer swept aggressively across the agricultural sector, the toxic purple clouds above were physically ripped apart by the rising thermal updrafts, revealing the stark, brilliant blue of the winter sky. But the sudden, violent thaw revealed far more than just the surviving winter wheat, as the thick layers of unnatural frost boiled away from the base of the hulking iron pillars supporting the wells. The physical evidence of the conspiracy was laid fully bare, carved deeply into the ancient northern masonry, perfectly preserved by the ice they had generated, were intricate, jagged southern rot runes. The dark, chemical salt used to paint the sigils was explicitly native to Garrick Stone's territory, and packed tightly into the crevices of the runes, serving as the biological binding agent for the dark magic, were crushed, expensive southern orchids. The heavy, cloying scent of poisoned honey spiked aggressively in the humid air, pointing an undeniable biological arrow directly at the woman standing in silver silks. The silence that followed the thermal explosion was total, broken only by the loud, hissing roar of the boiling earth. Mariska Vane took a rapid, stumbling step backward, the polite, frozen smile finally shattering utterly. Her face drained of all color, her eyes darting frantically toward Garrick, who was already drawing a curved southern blade, realizing the diplomatic illusion was dead. Vance Ashwood did not draw his sword. He did not need to. The terrifying primal apex predator that had been starving in the dark, slowly decaying over 3 long, continuous winters of unnatural frost since he severed their bond, was finally unleashed, fueled by the staggering heat of the restored valley and the blinding clarity of total betrayal. His dark eyes shifted completely to molten gold, glowing with a lethal, predatory luminance. "You poisoned my soil," the Alpha King whispered. The sound was barely a rasp, yet the sheer, terrifying density of the Alpha Command, woven into the words, forced every single southern mercenary in the vicinity to immediately drop to their knees, their hands flying to their throats as they choked on the sheer weight of his aura. "Vance, please, it was not me." Mariska shrieked, the elegant heiress suddenly dissolving into a pathetic, trembling mess. She clawed desperately at her pristine silks, her composure utterly destroyed as the imposing monarch took a sins-come ground-shaking step toward her. "Garrick forced me. He said the treaty required leverage. He said the cold would make you love me. I am stripping you of your titles, Mariska Vane," Vance decreed, his voice rising into a deafening, earth-shattering roar that vibrated against the very bedrock. He did not touch her. The sheer physical force of his presence was enough to send her collapsing into the wet, steaming mud. "Your alliance is nullified. Your bloodline is banished from the hinterlands. And if I ever smell your poisoned honey in my territory again, I will tear your spine from your body myself." Garrick Stone let out a desperate, guttural war cry, lunging forward with his curved blade aimed directly at the king's unprotected flank. But the usurper had vastly underestimated the physiological speed of a fully restored Northern Alpha. Vance moved with supernatural, terrifying velocity, his heavy, scarred hand shot out, catching Garrick by the throat mid-leap. The heavy impact halted the Southern leader's momentum, lifting him effortlessly off the ground. Garrick kicked and thrashed, his hands scrabbling uselessly against the thick, iron-like forearm crushing his windpipe. The dark magic in his veins sputtered and died, wholly overwhelmed by the radiating, boiling heat of the geothermal grids. "The iron pillars of the Royal Assembly require a new ornament," Vance gritted out, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles bulged beneath his skin. He did not break the usurper's neck. He simply tightened his grip until Garrick's eyes rolled back and his body went completely slack, dropping the unconscious man heavily into the mud. He turned to his northern guards, who were staring at their restored sovereign with unwavering, fanatical reverence. "Chain him to the dais. Let the entire court see the architect of their starvation." Throughout the entire explosive confrontation, Lyra Sterling had not moved. She had not flinched when the blade was drawn, nor had she gloated when the woman who had stolen her place collapsed into the dirt. She stood quietly beside the immense iron housing of the thermal well, her pale eyes meticulously tracking the pressure gauges of the geothermal lenses, ensuring the ambient heat remained perfectly stabilized. She was utterly detached from the political slaughter occurring 10 feet away. Her job was to fix the glass. The ruling of the kingdom belonged to the man who had cast her out. 2 months later, as the valley officially entered the second month of the thaw, the cavernous interior of the High Frost Court was completely transformed. The brutalist architectural marvel, which for years had been gripped by a perpetual, suffocating freeze, was now awash in magnificent radiating warmth. The deep earth magma channeled flawlessly through Lyra's thermal obsidian lenses fueled the roaring perimeter hearths until the flames danced brightly against the towering iron-wrought pillars. The thick skeletal frost that had choked the masonry was gone, replaced by the heavy, comforting scent of burning cedar and dry stone. The 2,000 members of the assembly had gathered once again, standing in heavy, suffocating silence. But this time they were not gathered to watch a ruin. They were gathered in profound, terrified reverence. At the center of the room, chained securely to the base of the obsidian dais, Garrick Stone knelt in his ongoing disgrace, permanently stripped of his furs and his dark magic. Mariska Vane was long gone, having been dragged screaming to the border by the royal guard, her poisoned honey scent systematically scrubbed from the royal wing by the very servants she had terrorized. Vance Ashwood stood at the exact center of the dais. He wore a crisp, dark linen tunic, his broad chest rising and falling with slow, deeply controlled breaths. His hands, bearing the fading scars from that day of brutal justice, rested loosely at his sides. He wore the crown of winter iron, but it no longer looked like a burden dragging him into the grave. He was the undisputed, terrifying apex of the North once again. And standing exactly 3 paces away from him, in the precise spot she had occupied 3 years ago, was Lyra. She still wore her heavy, weather-beaten grey cloak and her scorched leather apron. She had refused the delicate silk gowns the council handmaidens had frantically tried to press upon her. She had refused the hot baths and the silver brushes. Her raw, labour-scarred hands rested casually against her sides, and her pale, clear eyes looked at the roaring hearth fires with the quiet, assessing gaze of a master artisan checking her work. That horrific display of rejection 3 years ago was engineered to destroy her completely. When Vance had handed her the silver-rimmed dissolution cup in this very room, the entire court had waited for the weeping, the desperate clawing at his boots, the pitiful collapse of a lineageless Omega. Instead, she had walked out into the lethal void and returned holding the leash to the planet's core. She had not broken. She had calcified into something wholly indestructible. The imposing Alpha King took a slow, deliberate step down from the raised dais. The collective breath of the entire assembly hitched, the silence stretching so tightly it threatened to snap. Vance stopped exactly 1 foot away from her, respecting the strict physical boundary he was legally terrified to cross. He looked down at her. His storm-grey eyes were completely stripped of their arrogance, radiating a profound, desperate vulnerabilities that made the broad man look incredibly fragile. The muscle in his jaw ticked furiously as he engaged in a monumental battle of physiological self-restraint. His inner beast was clawing frantically at his ribs, begging him to fall to his knees, begging him to bury his face in her neck and inhale the scent of fresh rain and crushed blue pine needles until his lungs burst. "The Southern Alliance is completely eradicated," Vance said, his deep, rumbling baritone vibrating against the iron pillars. His voice was quiet, meant only for her, yet it carried the heavy, undeniable gravity of a confession. "The poison is cleansed from the keep. The valley is warm. The people will not starve." "Kaelan Drake is a highly competent engineer," Lyra replied, her voice maintaining that even, unyielding cadence. She refused to meet his eyes. She kept her gaze fixed casually on the center of his chest. "If he maintains the water flow over the primary cooling nodes, the thermal obsidian will outlast your reign." Vance swallowed hard, a visible jagged movement of his throat. He slowly reached up, his trembling fingers gripping the jagged edges of the winter iron crown resting on his brow. With a slow, agonizingly deliberate motion, he lifted the ancient symbol of his supreme authority off his head. He held the heavy iron crown out toward her, his bloodless knuckles contrasting sharply against the dark metal. "The throne is yours, Lyra," the sovereign whispered, the words scraping painfully against his vocal cords. A jagged, tearing sound ripped from his chest, a raw manifestation of the generational curse of isolation finally breaking him completely open. "I will step down. I will kneel in the mud. I will spend the rest of my miserable existence serving you in the lower scullery if you command it. Just, please, stay. The pack needs its Luna, and I am absolutely nothing without my mate." The entire grand hall held its breath. 2,000 wolves waited for the grand, emotional reconciliation. They waited for the stoic woman to finally crack, to weep tears of triumphant joy, to reach out and take the crown that had been so violently denied to her. They expected the magical, instantaneous absolution of 3 years of pure agony. Lyra looked at the heavy iron crown. She looked at the bloodless hands of the terrified, domesticated king offering her the world. Her inner wolf remained resolutely silent. The physical state of her severed mating mark, resting quietly beneath the collar of her tunic, remained completely dormant. There was no sudden, burning heat. There was no miraculous reweaving of the sacred thread. The acidic violence of the silver-rimmed dissolution cup had been absolute, and no amount of groveling, no amount of politically structuring could reverse a biological death. Lyra reached beneath her heavy grey cloak. She did not touch the crown. Instead, she withdrew a thick, perfectly preserved roll of cured vellum, bound tightly with a heavy leather cord. She unrolled it, revealing the binding territorial contract Kaelin had drafted in her cabin. Its terms guaranteed absolute independence for her mountain territory. "I do not want your crown, Vance," Lyra stated. Her voice was not loud, but the sheer, monumental apathy in her tone was a physical blade sliding cleanly between his ribs. She did not raise her pitch. She did not display a single micro-expression of anger or triumph. She was simply stating an undeniable geological fact. "I want your blood and iron on this parchment. Here, before your entire court, as the thaw begins, seal my sovereignty." Vance flinched violently, his broad frame recoiling as if she had struck him across the face with a heavy iron file. His hand, holding the crown, dropped slowly to his side, the cold metal clanking loudly against his thigh. "Lyra, please. And I certainly do not want a pack that only recognizes my value when they are freezing to death in the dark," she added quietly. He stared at the vellum, the reality of her demand crushing the last of his hope. Slowly, he handed the crown to his guard, drew a ceremonial dagger and sliced his palm. He pressed his bleeding hand to the bottom of the parchment, leaving a crimson print, then stamped it with his iron signet ring. The binding territorial contract was officially sealed. "You misunderstand the nature of survival, my king," she continued, her pale eyes finally lifting to meet his devastated, storm-grey stare. There was no warmth in her gaze. It was beautiful the way a blade was beautiful. "When you handed me the dissolution cup, you taught me that to rely on the protection of another is to invite the blade to your own throat. We are but fragile prey in a realm of fangs. I spent 3 years in the Obsidian Peaks forging my own fangs. I do not need yours to protect me." She stepped carefully around the paralyzed monarch. She did not run. She did not look back at the kneeling usurper, or the roaring hearths, or the 2,000 wolves who were finally seeing her true, unyielding power. She walked deliberately down the center aisle of the grand hall, her spine impeccably straight, her heavy climbing boots echoing rhythmically against the stone. Vance Ashwood stood completely frozen in the center of the dais, his bleeding hand falling uselessly to his side. He did not chase her. The legal and emotional boundary she'd drawn was absolute, an impenetrable fortress of fire and glass that he possessed no weapons to breach. He was a terrifying, all-powerful sovereign who had successfully reclaimed his entire empire, only to realize that the one single thing he truly desired was legally, permanently out of his reach. The heavy iron doors of the grand hall groaned open, admitting a rush of crisp, beautifully clean winter air. The magical rot was gone. The valley was thawing. The frost on the ancient masonry was already melting, dripping slowly onto the stone floor like the tears the stoic woman refused to shed. Lyra stepped out into the courtyard, turning her face toward the towering, jagged spires of the Obsidian Peaks, rising darkly against the twilight sky. The journey back to the geothermal plateau would be long, but she did not mind the cold. She was the undisputed sovereign of her own quiet, warm empire, a master artisan returning to her forge, carrying the heavy iron key to a sanctuary where she would never be unseen, unvalued, or unchosen ever again. Narrative ledger. The physical state of Lyra's severed mating mark remained completely dormant, a hollow, frozen patch of scarred tissue resting over her collarbone that refused to warm, even with the supreme apex of the north begging at her feet. The physical proximity of the tracker was rapidly expanding into infinity, the sovereign of the hinterlands left standing alone in his crowded, superheated hall, separated by an impenetrable, legally binding chasm, and the measurable level of the king's guilt torment registered as an eternal, suffocating hemorrhage of the soul. He would rule his perfect, thawed kingdom for the rest of his long life, but he would do so truly, permanently alone. Thank you for joining our quiet sanctuary. Did her silent dignity break your heart, or were you waiting for the moment he finally got on his knees? Let us know your favorite scene in the comments below. and don't forget to like and subscribe to witness more underdogs claim their crown.